Good afternoon. My name is Ian Balcom, and I'm the Executive Vice President and Provost of the University of Virginia. And I'm delighted to welcome you to today's Democracy Dialogue on Free Speech at Universities. The Karsh Institute of Democracy and the Miller Center host democracy dialogues with the goal of strengthening democracy through civil dialogue and debate. We hope that this series will encourage the free sharing of beliefs and ideas, regardless of political leaning. The dialogues are made possible thanks to the generous support of the George and Judy Marcus Democracy Praxis Fund, Ingrid and David Hang, and James Murray. During today's dialogue, experts will take a close look at how free speech relates to academic freedom at universities. This is a fundamental issue for all of us. You'll soon hear from our moderator, Leslie Kendrick, who brings her remarkable expertise in First Amendment issues to her roles as teacher, scholar, and as advisor to the provost. Leslie, I cannot tell you how grateful I am for your wisdom and your counsel and your advice. We're also fortunate to have a special guest who will introduce our panelists and kick off today's discussion. It's my pleasure to introduce one of our undergraduates, Jared Cooper. Jared's a fourth-year government major, a writer for the Virginia Undergraduate Law Review, and a co-host for Bipartisan, a student-run podcast that seeks to build consensus across the aisle and encourage healthy political dialogue. Jared, welcome.
Thank you, Provost Balcom, and good afternoon, everyone. The heart of this university has always been its unwavering commitment to freedom of expression and diversity of thought. This fundamental concept is a cornerstone, one that maintains that no single person or group alone possesses the solutions to the challenges of our time. Last year, I had the privilege to participate in the annual student oratory competition hosted by several organizations here on grounds. The question was, why does free speech matter at a public university? The words I wrote then still ring true now. In a country where it often seems we have confused arguing with understanding and rhetoric with reality, a simple truth remains. We cannot tackle the issues of today unless people begin to respectfully disagree. Each time an idea is challenged, it becomes stronger after scrutiny. Universities must remain a place where ideas can be challenged, deliberated, and understood. There must be a forum where opinions can be shared without the threat of violent escalation. And that place is our public universities. Today, our panel will shed light on the state of free speech in our universities. They will not always agree, and we thank them for that. They will disagree when necessary. They will dissent on specific remedies, but in doing so, they will provide us with a shining example of democratic dialogue, spirited discussions with the intent to understand. Our distinguished panelists include Jennifer Ruth and Jonathan Zimmerman. Professor Ruth is a professor and associate dean in the College of Arts and Sciences at Portland State University, and a co-author of It's Not Free Speech: Race, Democracy, and the Future of Academic Freedom. Professor Zimmerman, the Judy and Howard Berkowitz Professor in Education at the University of Pennsylvania, is an education historian, prolific writer, and co-editor of the Histories of American Education book series. Finally, our moderator this afternoon is Leslie Kendrick, the White Burkett Miller Professor of Law at the University of Virginia School of Law. Professor Kendrick also serves as a special advisor to the provost on free expression and inquiry, and she played a pivotal role in developing the university's statement on free expression. Each of them brings unique perspectives to today's discussion. That said, I am excited to ask the first question of our panelists today. When there is a contentious issue in the public square, what role, if any, do universities play in allowing all students to express their opinions? I will hand it off to them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jared. That was lovely. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, everyone who organized it. It's wonderful. Forgive me if I have some notes because I come from Portland, Oregon, flew cross country, and then graded a stack of undergraduate papers. So I'm a little bit, I need my notes. I'm in the School of Film, an associate dean as well. And in the School of Film, I teach a lot of Eastern European and East Asian film. So I was just grading papers on this wonderful film, Pavel Pawlikowski's 2013 film, Ida. So that's been in my head, so I need these notes to remind me of why I'm here. Okay, so contentious issues. We'll just jump right in, right, Jared? Thank you for that. First of all, I would just say that universities have an obligation to provide a safe environment, by which I mean physically safe, where students can hold rallies, protest, organize teach-ins, draft petitions, make demands on administration that may or may not then be met, and so on. What they should not do, what universities should not do when there's a contentious issue, is discourage these expressive activities, and certainly not threaten punishment of any kind for anything that doesn't rise to the level of threats of violence, sustained disruption of classes and events, or hate speech. And I think we might end up talking, if we have time, talking about hate speech. That's obviously how do you define that? What they should not do as well, and this is gonna be where I think my sensibility about the campus culture wars, the problem of free speech will come into play. I'm actually much more conversant with academic freedom than free speech. That's why Jared mentioned the title of my most recent book is It's Not Free Speech, speaking about academic freedom. So I'll try to distinguish between the two at some point today. But first, I just want to say what they should not do is see the turmoil as an occasion to condescend to or patronize students. What happened, I don't know if you're familiar with, it's become kind of the poster child for illiberal student leftism. There was an incident at Stanford Law School last spring with the circuit judge, Kyle Duncan. And after that, the Stanford Law School mandated a class on free speech. This follows a pattern that we see in a lot of places. Schools respond to what is perceived to be this generation's lack of commitment to free speech by spawning task forces, creating new curricula, speaker series, establishing centers and institutes on civil discourse and free speech. Millions of dollars from state legislators are coming to establish centers, framing this as redressing what they see as student ignorance in the ways of democracy. This wave of new initiatives strikes me as a kind of disciplining of students through speech, an attempt to use the institution to counter speech with speech designed to recalibrate their thinking. And this appears justified because the initiatives are offered as solutions to an existing problem. The problem is more often expressed as the problem of chilling speech on campuses, an epidemic of censoriousness. But it's also mobilized this discourse of the problem of free speech when student speech becomes too vigorous. Every contentious issue in the public square now gets pulled into this framing. Even the devastating events in the Middle East have become the occasion for numerous op-eds by writers with no expertise in the history of the conflict.
First Israel-Palestine reference, mark the time. Yeah.
And I have no expertise in it, so
Took us 11 minutes.
Of course, contentious issues in the public square, how could we not? So yeah, so even that, there was a Washington piece very recently that chided Jewish Americans for their disappointment with the university statements, or lack of them after the Hamas attacks, by arguing, this is what the Washington Post journalist argued, that these Jewish Americans who are disappointed are trying to get a shrinking cut of the identity politics spoils system, linking to a statement on something called the Calvin Report, which I'll talk about in a second. The journalist argues that, quote, Jews would be better served by encouraging universities to remain neutral. Many voices are taking this moment of Middle East conflict as a time to call on higher ed institutions to endorse the Calvin Report. This is a 1967 report that called for institutional neutrality on political and social questions. It was drafted during a period when there was a lot of protest around the Vietnam War, and there was a lot of protests to try to urge the University of Chicago to divest from apartheid South Africa. The Calvin Report, was a way to not answer those demands. Recent support for the report began building after institutions issued a bunch of statements after George Floyd's death. The underlying concern, of course, is that universities have forsaken knowledge for social justice, encouraged a kind of illiberalism in their environment. I would argue, this is how I see it, and remember, I come from Portland State. This is the land of Antifa. This is Portland. I have transgender students in all of we're very left, right? So I still, nonetheless, have, in my experience, the discourse of woke institutions and woke students that are intolerant of speech they don't like is a discourse. I'll wrap it up. I'm sorry, Jonathan. This is not to say that things haven't been changing on campuses as they are elsewhere. But another way to look at this is campus tensions, not a crisis, but tensions. There have been some gains of the rights of people to have their history told, express their gender and sexual identities, have those respected. And these gains have led to a renegotiation of speech norms, which is not the same thing as a problem of free speech. It's a renegotiation of speech norms. It's happened in our history many times. What is relatively new, and I'll stop because I don't mean to soapbox, but what is relatively new is the money that's gone into this. There's a number of books right now, Isaac Kamola and Ralph Wilson, Free Speech and Coke Money, The Manufacture of the Campus Culture War, Nancy McLean, Democracy in Chains, Brad Vivian, Campus Misinformation. But there's been a lot of research that's come out in the last few years about all the money that's gone into the think tanks and the fellowships and the centers and the institutes and the journalists at The Atlantic, Connor Friedersdorf, other people, to focus on little incidents in campuses and build them up into huge speech wars. My larger point is just that we cannot see this, we can't condescend to students right now that they don't understand democracy. Democracy right now is a place of struggle. It is messy. So the idea that they need to have mandatory curriculum on civics, I'm not sure that's the answer.
Wow. Well, first of all, let me just say, I'm really shocked to hear that the faculty and students at Portland State are on the political left. That just knocked me over. Yeah. Thank you to Jennifer for those fascinating comments, and thank you most of all for coming here and for inviting me. I mean, I'm having sort of an out-of-body experience. Like, what am I doing here, speaking at the rotunda about free speech? I mean, also, could you have ordered a nicer day? I mean, yeah, it is otherworldly, and I feel incredibly lucky to be here. I agree with most of what Jennifer said, but not all. And I think that I'm going to keep my comments short because I want to get to the other questions, and I also, most of all, want to hear from you. I do think that there's something different about our moment, which is troubling. Jennifer's right that there's been a renegotiation of these norms. But I am troubled by one part of them, which is what I call the psychologizing of politics, which I think has been a dominant strain on our campuses and relatively new in a historical frame over the past 20, 30 years. And by psychologizing politics, what I mean is, if you disagree with me, you don't necessarily say I disagree with you for the following reasons or facts. You say that I harmed you, that I triggered you, I microaggressed you. This is a relatively new language, and I think for free speech it is a problem because it's a cul-de-sac. If you say that you're microaggressed by something I say today, and you may be, I have pretty much one thing to say in response. I'm sorry. And I would be. Like, I'm not in this world to harm people. I suppose I could ask you a little bit more about why you felt harmed, but this is what I couldn't do and wouldn't do. Tell you that you weren't, right? I can't look into your soul and tell you whether you were harmed or not. So I think that way of thinking is somewhat of a cul-de-sac for our thinking. When I give this rap to my undergrads, very often they'll say, you're denying our feelings. And I say, no, it's the opposite. It's precisely the undeniability of your feelings that make them such a poor venue for discussion and speech. I understand that speech harms. It absolutely does. But if that becomes your rubric for deciding what can be said or not, especially on a college campus, it's going to be really difficult ultimately to speak at all. So I'll just share one anecdote that begins one of my books on this subject, which I think illustrates it really well. It's from Mary Beth Tinker. And I'm sure many people in this room know this. I'm sure there are people that have written books about it. But Mary Beth Tinker, when she was 13 years old, wore this black armband to Warren G. Harding Middle School in Des Moines, Iowa. And that, of course, became the Tinker v. Des Moines case, where several years later, Justice Fortas said that neither teachers nor students shed their First Amendment rights at the schoolhouse gate. Well, Mary Beth Tinker is not that much older than I am. And by the way, I love the fact she went to Warren Harding Middle School, because almost every historian thinks he was one of the worst presidents in American history. Anyway, I become friends with her because of our mutual interests. And Mary Beth Tinker, by the way, is fantastic. She spent her career as a nurse, and now she's devoting the remainder of her life to this issue, what we're talking about. So she came up to my class at Penn, and she tells her story, and she has the armband, which, by the way, she puts on the students. And the kind of historical preservationist part of me was very upset about this. I'm like, do you also have an original copy of the Declaration of Independence in your purse? It's like the armband. Mary Beth has recently told me she did give it to the National Archives, which made me happy. Anyway, she tells her story, and then the Q&A begins, and the students say, look, Ms. Tinker, you were fighting the good fight. You were fighting the war in Vietnam, right? That's what the armband was about. This Milo Yiannopoulos clown, this Ben Shapiro, Ann Coulter jokester, all they do is harm people with racist and misogynist and transphobic speech. Why should that be allowed? You're fighting the good fight, they're harming people. Well, Mary Beth Tinker wasn't having it. And this is what she said. She said, look, at Warren G. Harding Middle School, there were students who had dads and uncles that were fighting and dying in Southeast Asia. Do you think they weren't hurt by this snot-nosed kid wearing a symbol saying that their loved ones were risking everything for a lie? You don't think that hurt them? If that's what you think, you're not thinking enough. Of course it hurt them. It absolutely did. That was the point. Speech hurts. But once you decide that you're going to try to prevent the hurt, we're going to have a really hard time speaking at all.
Well, thank you to you both, and welcome everyone. I'm excited to be here to continue this conversation with Jennifer and John. I did want to say thank you to Ian Balcom and Jared Cooper for their wonderful introductions, and to the Miller Center and Kelsey Millay in particular for all of the preparations, the Karsh Institute for all their preparations, and really to everyone around the university who's made this event possible and has worked to make it so. Now, this event, as I understand it, has been in the works for quite a while. And we did not know at the outset just how timely it would be.
Here we go.
No, actually, I might be going in an unexpected direction. You know, I just wait and see. And I think Jared's first question raised for you and for us some of the most timely issues in front of us. But I, at the same time, don't want to lose sight of your particular areas of expertise and the reason that we put the two of you in dialogue together intentionally, which is within the vast panoply that's free speech at universities, the specific issue of academic freedom. So I wonder if we can unpack that a little bit. And maybe, Jennifer, you started, so maybe Jonathan, this time, let's shake it up a little bit.
I think we should go back and forth. I think Jennifer, she wrote a whole book about the subject. I think we should let her have her
Well,
say.
she kicked off last time. Do you want to kick off this time, or are you ceding your?
I'm seated.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And also, if I can just footnote what John said about the Milo Yiannopoulos and the discourse of harm and hurt. For me, it's exaggerated. Part of the problem is that these provocateurs were, in part, getting funded to create precisely the crisis of free speech on our campus that now we all seem to agree is occurring. It's part of a whole kind of machinery that worked extraordinarily well. After the Stanford Law Institute with Kyle Duncan, the right-wing press, the Substacks, instantly popped into action. Eventually, it made it into mainstream news. This is a very well orchestrated, and it distorts the realities on campus. Yes, my point of being on a very left campus is the fact that I've accidentally misgendered students. I've accidentally called one Black student by another Black student's name. And when I apologize, they say, no big deal. This is Portland. This is not, they're not filing complaints against me. They're not breaking down in tears. So I really have trouble. And I mean, it's not just, it can't just be anecdotal, right? It can't just be my experience at Portland State. I talked to many faculty. I just finished a term on Committee A for Academic Freedom on the AAUP. So I'm involved with faculty across the country. And I hear this echo, this sense that that's not my experience on campus, that students are sort of invoking their feelings as a way to shut down conversation. So let me
Jennifer, the Hamline event where the scholar...
Okay, let me just answer the academic freedom
Okay,
first.
sorry.
And we can talk about the Hamline event where Erica, she should not, whatever, we can talk about it in a second. But the academic freedom. So thank you for asking the question about academic freedom. That's actually my area. I don't have claims about restricting free speech. I think it's, I'm interested in Emily Bazelon and Tim Wu and different people who are making arguments about the problem of First Amendment absolutism and, regulation. I'm interested in all that. I don't have expertise in it, and I don't have a position on it. My position, and then the book Michael Berube, a Penn State professor, and I wrote, is very much about how the conflation of free speech and academic freedom is not doing us any favors at this moment in our culture. This moment, which I would consider a moment of democracy erosion and democracy backsliding, where you do have a whole machinery that's geared to tilt things, beginning with the Koch Foundation in 2010, beginning back with tobacco, when there was a both sides. When if you were interviewing someone about the dangers of tobacco to your health, you were pressured to interview someone who says, but it's my lifestyle. You had to do both sides. The whole both sides thing began back with tobacco, went to fossil fuels, and now it's about campus speech controversies. And it's funded by libertarian money, and the libertarian money has paved the way for the authoritarian legislation that we're seeing in Texas, Florida, and probably here. I'm not super familiar with Virginia. So that's my sense of how the free speech controversy has been framed. But at this moment, when these things are going on, and when you have social media flooding the public sphere with mis and disinformation, what we can't really afford is to have Milo Yiannopoulos, I can never say his name, as professors on faculty campuses. We can't really afford to have people who abuse their positions to be provocateurs and to sort of ride a wave to a fellowship at the Manhattan Institute or possibly a political career. So our point, we open the book with, does academic freedom protect white supremacists? We open very provocatively. We end the book very boringly, very boringly. We say, faculty must be evaluating each other. Faculty hold faculty accountable. The tenure system that evolved over time for rigorous peer review, rigorous evaluation of one another. Is your work within your field, does it make sense? Or are you making claims that seem to be wanting to sort of hitch your wagon to a culture war rhetoric that doesn't actually fit within your field or make sense within your field? What's the quality of your work? Free speech, by definition, the First Amendment, by definition, it doesn't evaluate quality. It says for us to be a democracy, every citizen has to have at least the potential to shape public perception through speech, right? But I'm going to draw on, I don't know if any of you are familiar, Robert Post is a Yale legal scholar, and he tried to create, there's no constitutional supports for academic freedom. There's no constitutional supports for academic freedom. There's the First Amendment, and the academic freedom is sometimes called the special concern of the First Amendment. But it really is not legally upheld. It's upheld through these practices that the American Association of Professors created, which Robert Post is also very involved in. I served on committee with Robert. But he has this distinction between democratic legitimation and democratic competence. Democratic legitimation is the idea, I know I'm not in a dictatorship because I'm not going to be thrown into jail because of something I say. Democratic competence is the idea that we have to discriminate in the field of democratic legitimation, the field of democracy and equality among citizens and citizen speech. We can't discriminate viewpoints. We can't discriminate. We can't say your opinion, you don't get to air your opinion. With academic freedom, we have to. Universities have to vet good ideas from bad ideas. We have to create knowledge that then there's some reliability. In the world of misinformation and disinformation, the processes that we've built up since 1915, the American Association of University Professors came into being, and I might mention how later, I don't want to go on and on. But it built all these practices for us to kind of keep track of each other and make sure that we're actually contributing to the common good and to production of knowledge. And if we conflate academic freedom and free speech, and we think that faculty are in this sphere where they can pop off in whatever way they want, we're not serving our function. That's the argument. So we end very boringly. We start with, does academic freedom protect white supremacists? And we end incredibly boringly with, create another committee. Faculty, create another committee, an academic freedom committee, where you can, for example, protect that Hamline professor who was not renewed, essentially fired in the world of academia, but not renewed, a contingent faculty. You can protect her. She can go to the Senate committee and say, I believe I was not renewed for reasons that are not reasonable. I did a good job. Evaluate me, even though I was dismissed because students were harmed, students complained. She can go to them.
They said they were harmed, which is different.
Jennifer, do you mind to just give a little background on the Hamline?
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
Okay, so Hamline was an incident where art history professor Erica Prater, I want to say is the last name, she was showing some portraits and paintings, Muslim, of the Prophet Muhammad. She did it apparently by all accounts, and the AUP, the American Association of University Professors, did an investigation and found that by all accounts, she prepared students, and I don't think there's anything wrong with preparing for them. We call it trigger warnings, and they've been kind of mocked in the public sphere, but when I teach, films are very visceral. I can read Lolita, Nabokov's Lolita, and I can be like, Humber Humber's a jerk. I hate Humber Humber. I can watch Kubrick's Lolita, and I see this teenage girl sexualized. And it affects me differently when I'm watching than reading. So I tell my students, watch out for this and that, be prepared, maybe read about the film before you watch it in case there's going to be something that does connect with your past and upset you. So anyway, she gave trigger warnings for Muslim students for whom it's forbidden to see an image of the Prophet. A Black Muslim student complained nonetheless. John may know the details better than I do. And the president of Hamline said she was very extreme in her language about it, and
as was the DEI director.
And they
said that the professor behaved in Islamophobic ways by showing this, even though she prefaced it by saying, obviously this is haram for many contemporary Muslims, but it hasn't always been. This is a history course, so we have to understand how these norms and these ideas have changed over time.
So if we have an academic freedom committee, when the president and the DEI leader says that, Erica takes it to the Senate committee. The Senate committee weighs in on how she handled the situation and whether she was professional or not. And then they make a recommendation. Everything in universities are recommendations to administration and the language that we have now, which is a problem, right? Because the president could have still listened to the DEI director and could have still not renewed her contract. Nonetheless, it would have created some resistance. So we're looking for ways for faculty to evaluate faculty rather than have capricious decisions by administrators or overreactions to student or alumni or parents' complaints. That's why we end with the boring academic freedom committee.
And look, again, Jennifer and I are largely in agreement on that last point. But the Hamline episode, to me, suggests that this problem, which Jennifer calls, just discourse or invented by Fox News, is not that. The events at Hamline had nothing to do with the Koch Foundation. They had nothing to do with Ron DeSantis, and they were brought to you all by members of people who we can safely say were on the political left. The challenges that Jennifer refers to involving the Koch Foundation and figures like that are real and terrifying. But we have to avoid what Roy Teixeira calls the Fox News fallacy. And the Fox News fallacy goes like this: if it's on Fox News, it must be wrong. There are a lot of things on Fox News that are wrong. There really are. But not everything, right? And when they reported about the Hamline incident, which we're discussing here, they correctly reported that it was brought to you by members of the political left. Each and every one of them. So we do have a problem. Jennifer's right. But if we frame that problem in partisan terms, the other side's doing a culture war and we're not, you know what that is? That's fueling the culture war, in my view. The only way the culture war settles, the only way we move beyond it, is if we're honest enough to admit that we all have perpetuated it in different ways. Look at something like book ban. Book banning is an enormous and terrible problem in this country right now. It is appalling. As a citizen and an educator, the idea that students and their families wouldn't have access to certain texts because perhaps one parent objected to that text, pasting in the complaint from some national organization, that is un-American. I can't put it any other way. But if that's the way you feel, if you were appalled by that, where were you when all the English departments were dropping The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn? Where were you? Where were you? And that book banning was not brought to you by the Republicans. That was brought to you by people firmly in my political aisle. Look, I don't live in Portland. I have Portland politics. I'm sure this is going to surprise you. Like my dad was in the Peace Corps. I was in the Peace Corps. I'm Jewish. I have a PhD. I'm a liberal Democrat. I'm sure just knock you over with a feather, right? But I think those of us on the left have to be honest about this question. I'm not equating those two episodes because the current book banning thing goes radically beyond Huck Finn and, To Kill a Mockingbird. But the reason Huck Finn and To Kill a Mockingbird are not taught in most English classes anymore is because of Democrats. It's not because of Republicans. And it seems to me that if we pretend that there's just one side to this culture war, we're actually fueling it.
I have lots of questions that we could continue with, but also I see, Jennifer, the indications that you might
film. I have a very expressive, dramatic.
You might want a dialogue, and we're here for a dialogue. So please, at some point, we'll move to the next question, but go right ahead.
I guess I have a lot of trouble with that framing because we're scholars, right? We have to historicize this a little bit. And the Ron DeSantis doesn't come out of nowhere. He comes out of the production of this whole controversy that has been fueled by right-wing money. Also, that's one point. The other point is that it's not Democrats who are saying, maybe I'll teach Beloved instead of Huck Finn. It's not Democrats, it's literature professors. When we hire literature professors, we don't ask, are you Democrat or Republican?
They're all Democrats.
Is that,
I mean,
why is that?
Right.
Why is that?
Good question.
Because you don't make a lot of money. You don't make a lot of money. And also, that's not even true. I am at Portland State, and I served for 3 years as my union's VP of Academic Freedom and Grievances. And I met lots of different faculty who had trouble with each other. So what would happen is that your faculty come, they don't trust the administration at all. So they come to the union and they say, my colleague is making my life miserable, please help me with this. Among faculty, there is a lot of disagreement. In the philosophy department, there's libertarians, there's Hayekians, there's all kinds of things. In the literature department, it's true too. There is quite a range. We maybe tilt a little bit more left from the humanities perspective. We're not interested in free markets. But we're not talking about who's elected and who you voted for, and we're not saying we can't teach Huck Finn. We are not saying that. If Huck Finn started to be taught less and less, because other things start to become more interesting. For example, different departments all over the country began to say, must we have a 2-credit Renaissance lit Shakespeare requirement? Is that really necessary? If they began to discuss, maybe we could work in some more contemporary literature or international literature, is that so wrong? Does that mean that we're turning our back on Western civilization or some kind of canon? I don't think so.
So you've heard it right here, friends, right? I mean, the other team, the bad guys, they do culture wars and they do censorship. We just make academic judgments, right? That's what we do because we're better than they are.
Oh my God, I can't believe you're framing what I said like that.
That's the way I heard it.
I can't believe that.
Yeah. The other team is bad and we are good. The other team is run by Republicans and it's a national campaign of dollars. It's essentially corrupt. But what we care about is freedom and liberty and academic values.
So let's bring this back to academic freedom, because I'm actually hearing some correspondences, some overlap in some of what you say, clearly also some differences. But I imagine that in regard to academic freedom, it sounds as though both of you think that there should be a kind of wide discretion for professors in teaching their subject to consider the best way to do that without interference from, first and foremost, the government, if you're talking about a state university, or trends and fashions and that sort of thing. And I want to ask about how did we get to this point? Could we talk a little bit about key historical moments that you think are important specifically to the formation of ideals about academic freedom? And I wonder, John, if we can start with you. And then
Sure. I mean, being the historian, I will go first this time. Since I'm a Z, I always am used to going second. It's what I do. Jennifer mentioned the AAUP report in 1915, and there's another one in 1940 that are kind of foundational for this. And the dates are important because they refer to the First World War and the Second World War. Obviously, we're not in the First World War yet. It had begun. We would get in 1917 for the first one. And ditto for the 1941, right? The war had begun, but we don't come in until 1941. But both of those wars, and in the case of World War II, the ensuing Cold War, were tremendous crises for academic freedom. During the First World War, there were several well-known, extremely prominent academicians who lost their jobs because they refused to support the war. And then the same thing would happen during the Second World War and indeed what we call the McCarthy period. There's a lot of myth-making about the McCarthy period. To this day, we imagine that the academic freedom strictures that we made actually protected dissent. They did not. They did not. These ideas were observed in the breach. And one of the books that I wrote was about college teaching, the history of college teaching during this time. And, reading the accounts of professors who were teaching during the 1950s in this country was deeply chilling because, a lot of them, for example, refused to teach about Karl Marx. And it's pretty hard to understand the history of the modern West without thinking about Karl Marx. But they couldn't because they didn't know how it might be twisted, not just by students or colleagues or administrators, but by spies, by people who came into the classroom just to report on what you were doing and telling some very bad actors about it later. So, that for me, I keep coming back to that history. And especially the history of fear, the fear that both faculty and students had about even exploring certain subjects, let alone saying what they thought about those subjects, because they didn't know who was listening and they didn't know what would happen to them. So it strikes me that, we can disagree, and I'm sure we will, about the sources of the fear, the causes of it, the consequences of it, but I do think that we're living in a very scary moment again. I think the fears are different, but I think there's a huge amount of evidence that lots and lots of people are afraid to say what they think. I think if you're 19, it's an incredibly hard moment. I don't know about you, but when I was 19, I really cared about what other 19-year-olds thought, especially about me. I think 19-year-olds who deny that are most likely lying, or at least dissembling. And I have only empathy for my 19-year-old students who are afraid that they will post or say something that will get them vilified by thousands or tens of thousands of strangers. Like if I were 19, I would just stay away from politics altogether. Please, 19-year-olds, I'm not encouraging you to do that. What I'm saying is I empathize with you if you decide to do that. Those are two different things. I get it. I get it. Now, that's not McCarthyism. It's entirely different from McCarthyism. The Venn diagram, the dark space, it's always fear, right? So there's change over time always, but then there's continuity. And if you think about all this being a Venn diagram, if you're talking about both academic freedom and free speech, the dark place, and I mean that literally and figuratively, it's always fear, always.
Can I, let's see. So you just said that this is entirely different. This fear is entirely different from McCarthy. You said that. You literally said that. And if I could also say, I'm actually quoting you, whereas you mischaracterized what I had to say and caricatured it and said, you see it right here, people. They're saying you're the bad guy, the Republicans are the bad guys and the Democrats know better. That's not what I said. I said we don't come to curricular decisions from a partisan point of view. So to say that we're Democrats making these decisions rings false to me, because that's not how we approach our jobs. So let me just say that, and then let's get back to the McCarthy era, because Johnson's absolutely right. The American Association of University Professors, a good friend of mine, Ellen Schrecker, who's an historian, wrote this wonderful book called No Ivory Tower, and about how much the AAUP and notions and the concept of academic freedom was failed professors during the McCarthy era when they had to do loyalty oaths. A number of people are saying that we are seeing another moment of what's often called the Red Scare. I have a colleague who calls it the Black Scare, because whereas during the Red Scare, there was a lot of fear of international communism, and that actually overlapped, was part of Black labor activists in the South, a lot of the Black activists and Black laborers were joining the Communist Party. It was very much about race, and of course that was only furthered with the desegregation and the Brown v. Board, and then the introduction of African Americans into our student population. So the Black-Red scares almost always go together. Let me give you an example. So I was very involved in helping faculty senates, because from my point of view, faculty need to kind of gain back some control over the way that the way that this is playing out, to the point where someone like Ron DeSantis can say, we're going to restrict teaching, we're going to create fear in the classroom so that you prune your syllabus and you don't teach the text about race, you don't teach critical race theory, et cetera. We're in this place where the state is trying to dictate our curriculum, whether they have expertise and training in that area or not. They are saying, I'm elected, I get to decide. The public is telling me I get to decide. That's an extraordinarily dangerous place to be. Think of the Soviet Union and the idea that even the physics has to carry a kind of communist element to it. Many people died because expertise was not valued or it wasn't organized in the way, it was organized ideologically. And that's what we're seeing now. So we're seeing another McCarthy era, absolutely. And it is frankly coming from the red states. But there was another point that I wanted to make about.
Jennifer, let me apologize and let me see if I can be a little more precise about what I was saying, okay? What I was saying was that I agree with you that the major source of both fear and censorship right now in America is the political right. We agree about that. And specifically, the politicians like DeSantis who are trying to, pass these ed scare laws, right? And erode not just at the K through 12 level, but also, academic freedom at the college level, like the example of New College. What I object to, though, about the framing is the idea that they represent the only threat. That's what I object to. I think there is a threat that comes from what can fairly be called the left. Let me give you another very, to me, obvious example. And again, it may not be obvious to some of you, but to me it is. The American Anthropological Association accepted a panel called Let's Talk About Sex, Baby, the ongoing importance of the sex binary. And it was, again, all anthropologists. They all happen to be women. At least one of them was self-described as gay, who talked about the idea of sex being a binary as still being a very useful concept in anthropology, especially physical anthropology. So one of the anthropologists was somebody who studies skeletons, and she's saying, look, we need that idea. Gender, of course, is a different thing, right? Gender is something that culture, right, creates and imposes and spreads. But skeletons, they don't have culture. They have like a physicality, and that binary is really important. Well, it was accepted, but then there was so much protest about the allegedly transphobic nature of this panel. Even after it had been accepted, it was rejected. Now, that too, it seems to me, represents a threat, a deep threat to dialogue, exchange, and academic freedom. It is different from the Ron DeSantis threat. But the point I keep trying to make to audiences is if, like me, you're appalled by the threat from the political right, we're not going to change that if we imagine that's the only threat. Americans are too smart for that. They will see that we're being disingenuous and we're not owning the fact that in some of our own precincts, we have not actually protected the freedom of the people around us. Now, again, those panelists are free to go and say whatever they want in other contexts. And in fact, Heterodox Academy staged their canceled panel on the web, right? They didn't die, they weren't arrested, they weren't sent to the gulag, right? But it does seem to me there's a principle here at stake that we need to respect despite the differences if we want to persuade people about the need to protect academic freedom. Once we code it as simply something that Ron DeSantis erodes, even though he does, we're done. It won't work. It's not honest.
Who's the we there? We're done.
We in the professoriate, because academic freedom is under threat, right? Yeah. And so the question is, how do you rebut that threat? And my answer is not by imagining that it only has one source. That's my answer. Not by imagining that. It is, Jennifer is right, it is the most dangerous source. It is the most urgent and scary source. It is not the only one.
Jennifer, do you want to take a moment to reframe and then we'll move?
Yeah, and actually I remembered, I lost my train of thought as I knew I would earlier when Jonathan started talking. But I wanted to explain about the black and the red scare. So I was involved in faculty senates passing resolutions to defend against this kind of violation of academic freedom, because the attack on critical race theory, it disproportionately, of course, affects scholars who come out of Black studies, Africana studies departments, gender studies faculty, but it's a direct threat to all faculty and our ability to hire who we want, to figure out what kind of curriculum we want, et cetera. So a couple of us in the African American Policy Forum thought that it would be useful for faculty senates to have some kind of statement in this and to call on their provosts and presidents to stand behind academic freedom during the height of the anti-CRT, the caricaturing of CRT. I think we're all familiar now with the fact that Chris Rufo brazenly said, the problem is that he succeeded, brazenly said in a tweet, I'm going to empty critical race theory of its meaning and fill it with everything that scares white Americans. He literally said that. And yet when we all acknowledged it, and yet he still succeeded in doing that, right? So anyway, we were passing Senate resolutions and over like 90 institutions across the country. It got very little media attention because it's not a student freaking out about cultural appropriation. It's not a student freaking out about being misgendered. It got very little media attention, but faculty senates across the country passed this resolution. When UT Austin passed this resolution, and I actually was invited because I had worked with the Academic Freedom Committee there to get the resolution going. I was invited to be there by Zoom, that was during COVID. So I watched the Senate discussion, and it was fascinating when they said, we want to propose defending teaching about race, gender, racial justice, et cetera, as part of academic freedom. And we want our president and provost to stand for that. When the Senate discussed it, there was one guy who later went on to sue, he's one of these, he was an accountant. He's an accountant who sued Texas A&M because he said he didn't get the job because of affirmative action. Or he's a known sort of person who's engaging in these activities on purpose and sort of organizing his life around them. One guy, he literally spoke against the resolution for 5 minutes. Everybody else was having a dialogue. Everybody else, there was a biologist who said, you know, I didn't think I really had a dog in this fight of critical race theory, but now I'm realizing that I do reproductive stuff, and if I can't research of Planned Parenthood, that's going to affect my teaching. Another person who talks about chemicals in the air and climate change. This is, you know, we don't stand up for ourselves now. It's going to spread all over. Well, this one guy, Richard Lowry, he videos himself on Zoom, sends his little clip talking about critical race theory. It was a performance within an actual Senate discussion, right? The resolution passed. He sends it to Fox News. Tucker Carlson puts it on. The next 2 or 3 days later, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, he holds a press conference and he says, I'm going to abolish tenure. I'm going to revoke it for everyone who teaches critical race theory. And he calls the faculty senate loony Marxists. I just find that really fascinating, right? Because the black scare, the red scare. They're literally speaking up for critical race theory, and he's calling them loony Marxists. It's this rhetoric that is so dangerous. The other thing that I would just want to mention is the idea about students being afraid. Yeah, they are, because this is a tense moment. There is a moment where things have gotten really pitched, and there's a lot of self-consciousness. There's a lot of my students, you know, defaulting to they. I'm trying to, I don't know what it's like at UVA, but I'm trying to default to use they for everybody instead of he or she. So students are getting the hang of that, and it can be a little bit tricky. But the surveys, you have to look closer. You can't just take the headlines. The press has a big incentive of sensationalizing all of this. And it's not, and I'm not saying that there's no problems and there's no incident. The Hamline art historian should not have been not renewed. That was absolutely wrong. No question about it. And I'm also not saying it's not tense on campuses. It can be and often is. But what I'm saying is that it's been sensationalized. And if you look at the surveys that say that students are afraid to speak, they've been asked by FIRE questions like, would you say that Black lives, they've been asked extraordinarily provocative questions. Do you feel like you could say in the classroom that Black Lives Matter is really about white lives not mattering? They're asked, if you actually read the surveys that students have answered, when they say, no, I would not feel comfortable saying that. That doesn't mean, so it's really a manipulated whole discourse that's in the mainstream media that has gotten picked up and being perceived as this massive problem. It's not easy, it's difficult. Palestine, what's often called the third rail of academia. You know, we can stand up for race, we can stand up for all these kinds of things. The Israel-Palestine thing is considered the third rail, and it broke the AAUP around the Stephen Salaita moment. It broke the AAUP, it just fractured it. The boycott, divest movement broke the AAUP. So it's not easy, but we have to continue to historicize, contextualize, continue to speak, not sensationalize.
Great. So I want to get us to audience questions in a moment. But I've been hearing from both of you, again, some overlap that I wonder if you could take 30 seconds to 30 seconds to define. So it's that I hear both of you arguing for a robust academic freedom for faculty within their area of expertise. I hear both of you saying that certain types of opinions, people's political views, their closely held private beliefs should not be relevant to whether you said this is not how we're deciding who to hire, and I think you would agree. But I have a feeling that you draw the lines a little differently about what faculty have either academic freedom to say or kind of free speech rights as a private citizen to say. Maybe you want to think of that as academic freedom. I wonder if just 30 seconds on where that line is.
The question isn't so much about the line, but who gets to draw it. So who has the authority to decide what you can say and what you can't say? And that's what academic freedom is. It says the politician, the dictator, the alumni, the donor who's got loads of money, the board of trustees, boards have enormous power in the way that our bylaws are written, but it would violate academic freedom nonetheless. There's a lot of uneven and contradictory aspects about university governance. It would violate academic freedom for them to try to decide where to draw the line. So the question about where you draw the line, it has to be your peers. So for example, we talk about Amy Wax and a couple of people. We wouldn't, and I'm sure people—
First Amy Wax reference. Yeah.
Well, to keep it to 30 seconds,
Okay, yeah, so
that example will be on the table, but let's maybe get the,
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, look, we have to give people an extraordinarily wide berth. We really do. But we're at a moment now, it seems to me, where everybody is contradicting themselves. So, you know, on my campus, I heard lots of people on the left say, you know, we have to rein in hate speech and all this terrible rhetoric that's coming from people like Amy Wax. Now, like they're all talking about the need for free speech for somebody who says, from the river to the sea, or glory to our resistance fighters. Now, I'm not saying that's hate speech. I'm saying that a lot of people construe it as such. And if you're the sort of person who was walking around campus talking about the need to expel hate speech, now you're getting hoisted on your own petard. All right? On the right, it's exactly the same thing, right? All these people complaining about these speech codes, some of which is radically exaggerated, that are allegedly restricting free speech on campus, now they hear about the river to the sea thing and they're like, why isn't the campus shutting this down? Right? Like, how could we allow this hate speech? It's like, dude, weren't you the person just saying a few months ago you didn't like speech codes? Like, could we just have a little consistency just once, just one time? I think the answer is
there.
no.
Okay, great. Thank you both so much. It's been really a pleasure to hear your views and to have both of you here with your expertise and together. It's just incredible. So I think we have a lot of different topics on the table, and I'm sure that some listeners within our community of listeners here or virtually might have some questions. So I invite people who would like to ask a question within the room here to use the microphone that's about halfway back there. So feel free to hop up and ask a question. And it looks like I have an online question that maybe I'll ask while we are getting a line going. Okay, so this one brings in yet another topic that's free speech related. Could you explain time, place, and manner restrictions on free speech? How does that doctrine impact how people can protest or demonstrate? Would either of you like to?
You, the law professor.
The real expert is the moderator.
Well, this is not my soapbox. I'm here as a I'm a facilitator for your dialogue. So if either of you wants to speak to that, feel free.
Look, you are the expert, but it seems to me that our courts have done a pretty good job with that question. You know, I mean, what the courts have said is that the limits to it are when there's a direct and immediate threat of physical harm. And I think that's a very good standard. Look, no right is absolute. You can't call the White House and say you're going to shoot the president. I think that's a good thing, that is illegal. And what the courts have said is that speech is protected unless there is a direct and immediate threat of physical harm, which, by the way, we've seen in the past 3 weeks. Let's not forget that, right? You know, I think from the river to the sea should be protected. I don't think calling up Hillel and saying you're going to bomb it should be protected, right? They're both acts of speech. One is protected and one is not, and it's because of lawyers and judges like Leslie that we've got that standard and we should abide by it.
I would agree with that entirely. My only sort of caveat, it's not even a caveat, it's just sort of an additional question is about social media and the fact that it has created the link between imminent harm, and someone's statements made it much more difficult because it's diffused misinformation, disinformation all over the place. So the sort of violence is more stochastic than it is an immediate, direct relationship. So I think that creates the kinds of questions that people are struggling with around how do you regulate? Who would you empower to regulate social media? So that's just an additional.
Right. And you know, time, place, manner restrictions, these are things that are content neutral. They're not in regard to the content of the speech. It's instead, these places are open at this time, amplified sound, yes or no, these types of questions. Both universities and governments generally utilize those quite a bit, mostly to facilitate all of the competing uses of their space, classrooms, studying, speaking events, and so forth. Let's get a question from inside the room. Go right ahead.
I'm curious about anonymous speech. Specifically, what do you think is your approach towards disseminating videos taken during campus protests that do not blur participants' faces? And relatedly, what is your approach towards the wearing of face covers during said protests? And does it differentiate between the covering type, e.g. a white hood versus a Palestinian kafia?
You know, I think the microphone distorted your voice. You might be better off just speaking it, because I had a lot of trouble. Yeah.
Thomas Jefferson didn't need a microphone.
Okay, anonymous speech.
Dissemination of videos taken during campus protests that do not blur participants' faces, and relatedly, what is your approach towards the wearing of face covers during said protests? And does it differentiate between the type of face covering, e.g. a white hood versus a Palestinian kafia?
Again, question for the lawyer.
I like the way it's framed, though, or the way it's been set up. But
So let's stipulate that generally speaking, the First Amendment protects people filming events that are occurring in public places, in public. And also allows content neutral regulations of things like masks, although that has been a changing and evolving area recently because of the pandemic, which saw lots of states lift what had been long existing masking rules. All right, so there's some background there that states are generally permitted to make rules about masks if they do it in a content neutral way, and generally speaking, the First Amendment forbids, prohibitions on people recording activities that are happening in a public place. Maybe normatively, there are additional elements here, distribution of film that may have been properly taken, wide distribution on social media, and differences in terms of the types of coverings, if we're talking about face coverings. Do you have anything from a normative perspective about how you think that should be handled? Or maybe you think the sort of underlying premises of the law are mistaken. You have any thoughts there?
it's really not something that I understand, looked into enough to have a strong opinion about.
I'm just glad I don't have to make those decisions. I mean, this is an extraordinarily hard time to be a university administrator. I have only empathy. Yeah, really hard.
Yeah.
Let's take another question in the room.
There you go. Hi, my name is Walter Smith. I'm a triple alumnus, a past parent, and a current parent. And I'm triggered by what you all said.
I'm glad you're talking about it. I think that's very healthy.
And well, those are because everything was, my goodness, Fox News and the conspiracy theories and all I don't trust any of those news sources. So my question is, I agree on academic freedom. And the reason I stated my name, I'm against the masking. There was a law. It's the anti-Klan laws. They're there. We should be able to speak and say things that you might find offensive and disagree with and not have to hide our faces. So also the academic freedom. I agree on academic freedom, but it didn't just come out of nowhere, that this pushback. And so does academic freedom, is it an absolute right, or are there some responsibilities for you to have the academic freedom. And I think that is kind of what's generating some of this. To me, the most obvious was the compelled speech of DEI statements. And the people in the academy did not raise their hand and go, hey, you can't do that to me. You're forcing me to think in a certain way. So I'm just, is it an absolute right, or do you guys have some responsibility to play it fair and earn your freedom?
So I can answer that one, I think, because it's not an absolute right by any means. There's all kinds of ways in which we can get fired, professional codes of conduct, neglect of classes, etc. The other thing is that it's actually, there's a reason why the 1915 Declaration and the 1940 statement that both Jonathan and I have referred to from the American Association of Professors, which is really the first definitions of academic freedom. There's a reason why their title is Academic Freedom and Tenure, or Principles of Academic Freedom and Tenure. Because it really is, it's a pragmatic, it's a material question, actually. It's not a philosophical question. It's a material question of, do I have job security such that if I do something that it calls my fitness, my ability, my competence into question, and we do have responsibility. So actually, if I can just put a pin in that and come right back, we are not, in the AAUP says in the statements, you're not supposed to bring, you can't walk into a classroom on First Amendment law and talk about astronomy, right? You can't constantly bring in irrelevant stuff. It has to be relevant. There's all kinds of rules and rights and responsibilities, right? Responsibilities. But so the fact is, if you do something that raises questions about how you're conducting your professorial tasks, who has the authority to decide whether you've crossed a line or not? So if you do not have academic freedom, it quite literally means you don't have a contractual right to a jury of your peers. That's literally what it means. It means that a supervisor, the department chair, because Erica Prater was a contingent faculty, an adjunct faculty, she hadn't been through the promotion and tenure process. There was no commitment on the university's part to her. She wasn't getting paid a decent salary. She didn't have an office probably. Because there was no commitment to her, the department chair could just say, you're causing a headache. This incident is a problem. The DEI person is mad at me. The president's mad at me. You're gone. If that person had had tenure, it would have been a different story. Academic freedom is the right, a contractual right to have your disciplinary peers. Other art historians say what she did was right or wrong. So there's loads of responsibilities that go into it. It's not just a philosophical concept. It's actually a practical, material way that we organize the profession.
I agree with all of that, especially the part about adjuncts, which I think is probably the most important thing, right? And the thing our students know the least about, because like when I was 19, I didn't know if my professor was an adjunct or not. Like I didn't really care. And it was also a very primitive time. There was no such thing as Google. You know, it was before human beings walked erect, you know, we still had like gills and stuff, you know. But that's an enormous crisis. Because, you know, if like Erica Prater, you don't have the protections of tenure, they can you at any point. I do want to say, however, that I read the gentleman's question a little bit differently, and maybe incorrectly, asking what her responsibility was, because it seems to me that our responsibility is to acknowledge the places where perhaps we've made the problem worse as professors. And I believe the DEI statements are in that category. I was in a debate about this subject with somebody in a rather public place, and I said, suppose I'm a candidate for a job and they ask for a DEI statement, and what I write is I think the DEI offices are doing a very poor job of protecting intellectual diversity, and I cite the Hamline thing as an example. Will I get the job? And he said no, and you shouldn't. Well, what does that tell you? I mean, this was one man talking, right? But to me, of course, it proved my point. That's always what we think, right? It proved my point that there.
What did he say?
No. What he said is, you know, it shows that you're not aboard, right, with the real need for diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, I believe that everyone wants those things, but I also believe that they define those things in radically different ways. And I think, as per the Hamline example, a lot of the things that DEI offices have done should be subjected to deep critique. But if you wrote that in your DEI statement, you were shooting yourself in the foot. And I would not advise any of my doctoral students to do that if they wanted a job. That is a problem. And we need to take, to quote the gentleman, responsibility for that problem.
I think I will turn to another online question. When people voice opinions on objectively wrong facts, but will not listen to any other set of facts, how do we push people to listen as well as speak?
Yeah, screw you. Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is the heart of the problem, right? Right? Is that we're not teaching people to do that. We're teaching them to hate on people they disagree with.
I don't think we're teaching
right?
that.
Well, where does
I
it
don't
come
know
from
anyone
then?
who's teaching that.
How does it happen? It's just in the ether? Just suddenly people start hating on
Well,
each
I
other?
think I kind of referred to where it comes from. It comes from the creation of a kind of both sidesism that serves a lot of interests, beginning with tobacco, beginning with fossil fuel. It comes, Dan Patrick, I'm going to go back to Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor, who said, I'm going to abolish tenure. He didn't really want to abolish tenure. He did abolish DEI. They did get through the legislature abolishing DEI. He did not abolish tenure. What he's doing, he is all about school choice and school vouchers and gutting public education in the state of Texas. By politicizing campuses, universities, teachers, and say that we're all teaching people to hate. He literally said that in his press conference. He said, do you want your kids, and he was speaking about college students, not kids, not elementary school. He said, do you want your kids to come in and be told that they're the oppressor? Well, that's what's happening. That's not what's happening.
Right. You're right. It isn't what's happening. And I yield to nobody in my loathing of Dan Patrick, right? But that also wasn't all I was talking about. Look, well before there was Dan Patrick, or well before he was lieutenant governor, well before there was the Koch Foundation, or the Koch Foundation as you know it, there was Bill Bishop. And Bill Bishop wrote a book called The Big Sort. It's now probably 15, 20 years old. So it predates a lot of the things Jennifer's talking about. And what he does is he just has a couple interesting graphs comparing the 70s and the early aughts, like the mid-2000s. And here's what he asks. Do you have a friend of a different political party? Have you ever dated somebody of a different political party? If you're a parent, would you be okay with your kid dating somebody of a political party? Do you have a neighbor of a different political party? And friends, the line, it's straight down. It is a vector, baby, and vectors have strength and direction. It goes from the 70s just like that, well before all this stuff we're talking about. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a society where people are taught, and they are taught in all kinds of ways, not just at universities, everywhere, to imagine people that disagree with them not just as adversaries, but as evil. Watch Fox and watch MSNBC. And watch the way they characterize the other side. These aren't just people we think are wrong-headed or maybe even misguided. They are fundamentally evil. And all of that, it has a 50-year history. We're just at the tail end. And the internet, which Jennifer referred to earlier, obviously accelerated it radically. So that's the kind of hate I'm talking about. And I'm not holding anyone in particular responsible for it. I'm holding all of us responsible for it. We've all done that. All of us have. By imagining our adversaries not just as adversaries, but as evil.
I know we have more questions that I'm sure are brilliant, but as moderator, I think one of my key jobs is to end on time. So let me just say an enormous thank you to both Jennifer and John. It was really fascinating to hear your points of correspondence, your points of departure. And I'm sure everyone in the audience, both here in the Dome Room and online, had your own points of disagreement and possibly agreement. And what I'm the most thankful for is that we work in a place, live in a place, have a kind of community where we can have this kind of conversation. And I thank both of you for making that happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.